Hi, everyone. Welcome to Mergers and Acquisitions, the podcast of the Society for Economic Anthropology. My name is Kelly McCowan, and I'm your host for our current series on unemployment. Now, believe it or not, this is actually the last episode in that series, and it promises to be a good one. See, for the last decade or so, there's been a lot of talk in the social sciences and the popular American media about things like automation, the rise of the robots, technological unemployment, universal basic income, and so on. In short, a lot of talk about the end of work as we know it. James Ferguson has even suggested that with this apparent crisis of productivism, a new politics of distribution might be in the offing. But here's the thing. Ethnographers are finding that many of the people who would seemingly benefit the most from universal basic income or more robust cash transfer schemes actually want jobs. They don't want to be liberated from employment. They want to be employed. Today I'm joined by someone who can shine some light on all of this. Dr. Liz Fouksman is a lecturer at the Center for Public Policy Research in the School of Education, Communication and Society at King's College London. Liz has done some remarkable qualitative research in South Africa and Namibia and made the case that the persistent attachment to formal wage labor reflects a deeply rooted moral economy of work. Liz, thank you so much for being here.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So I want to start, Liz, we typically interview anthropologists on the show, but you're not trained as an anthropologist. You certainly dialogue with anthropologists, however, like Tanya Lee and James Ferguson. So can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you started to engage with this work?
Sure. So my background is actually international development. That's what I have a PhD in. But international development isn't a discipline. It's an interdisciplinary field, right? So it's sort of make your own adventure. And within international development, I was really intrigued by anthropological approaches such as James Ferguson or Tanya Lee. So I think the adventure that I picked within international development was heavily influenced by anthropological thinking and anthropological methods. I think that was sort of the root of my ongoing engagement.
That makes sense. I mean, it comes across very clearly in your work. I want to start by asking you about your 2020 piece, The Moral Economy of Work, which actually opens with a puzzle described by Tanya Lee. This is essentially that we live in a time where, as she puts it, there are runaway profits, astronomical wealth, and impressive technological capacity, but there's an absence of outrage and meaningful collective actions. And you actually propose a very novel solution to this puzzle using the concept of moral economy. Can you tell me a little bit more about your solution to the puzzle?
Sure. So I think just to take a step back and think about the puzzle maybe more broadly at first, sure. I just want to say that for me, the puzzle is also really personal. The way I became really interested in the kind of questions that I explore around work and money and inequality and distribution initially were really personal questions around, why do we still structure work the way we do, even though it's so clearly not actually effective or working or pleasant for so many people, across the scale of the types of jobs. So I have, by most metrics, a really, really good job, right, as an academic. And there's still elements to it that are, really not that great, such as, for instance, the amount of hours that most academics put in on a weekly basis. And it seemed like a highly solvable problem. I mean, again, just starting off by looking at academia itself, there's a lot of people who want to be academics who are really gifted, who can't get academic jobs. People who have the academic jobs always complain about having way too much to do and way too many hours. Highly solvable problem, just hire more people, right? But clearly we're not doing that. So for me, it started off as this puzzle of why is work still organized the way it is when it's not working for people on kind of either end of the good job, bad job spectrum? And then I actually heard Tanya Lee give this paper as a talk at a conference. It was the Development Studies Association UK conference. And I realized that, the thing that I had been wondering on this sort of really personal level was actually a much bigger question that I think Tanya's talk really kind of crystallized. And that is this bigger question of, why in an age of extreme affluence and technological advancement, we're still living with things like, poverty, inequality, misery, all of these kind of bads of society when we so clearly could fix it, right? And it doesn't seem like it should be all that hard if we put our mind to it. So I think that's kind of the bigger puzzle that I'm really intrigued by, again, starting off on this really personal level. And then the kind of the more micro version of that is I started working in South Africa back in 2015. I actually worked there for 2 years. And it seemed to me like it was kind of a microcosm of this question where these factors were really extreme. So South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world. It has really, really high unemployment. So pre-COVID, it was close to 40% if you count discouraged job seekers. It has this history of colonialism and apartheid and racial dispossession and exploitation, expropriation. So you would think that if anywhere there's a lot of outrage and demands for redistribution and kind of radical solutions, it would be in a place like South Africa. And South Africa does have a lot of outrage and does have a lot of political mobilization, but it's not the form that I, at least coming from my particular vantage point, would have expected. And a lot of people, when they think about South Africa, they're kind of very fixated on crime in South Africa and levels of violence. But I actually think you could flip that and ask, why isn't there more crime? Why isn't there more violence? Because again, in such an unequal society, you would think people would be demanding radical forms of wealth redistribution, right? But I actually think these demands are kind of muted. And I became really curious as to why. And I thought, this was kind of a micro version of this macro puzzle. And when I started doing research in South Africa, I talked to people who I thought would be the most likely to demand these kind of radical shifts in the way we think about wealth and distribution. That was people who were excluded from formal labor markets, who are quite poor. My key field site in South Africa is inner city Johannesburg, a place called Jeppestown. And I found that people kind of echoed the same sorts of things you hear from quite right-wing policymakers in places like the US and the UK. Phrases like, you can't get money for nothing, or, oh, if you get money for nothing from the government, you'll become lazy or you'll spend it on the wrong things.
It's interesting. They are really seemingly afraid of a laziness epidemic that would follow from just giving people money.
Yeah, exactly. And it didn't make sense to me. And the only way that I could make sense of it is by taking up this kind of moral economy framework, or this more moral or cultural kind of vantage point on it. Because, when I'd ask people, well, would you become lazy? If, for example, you got an unemployment check or a grant from the government every month, very few people said yes. I had a couple, but most people would kind of laugh and say, no, I wouldn't be lazy, but other people would be. That's definitely true that other people would be. And then sometimes I would joke and say, well, can you introduce me to the lazy people? Because I haven't met anyone who, says that they would become lazy. And, they would laugh. But
yeah, I had this same exact experience in Norway. I remember one time I was talking to an unemployed engineer from Portugal. We were talking about the sick leave system. And he said, if we had this system in Portugal, we destroy it overnight. And I said, well, you're not destroying it. And he said, well, that's not what you do in Norway. So I was fascinated by this tendency, at least that he was describing among immigrants, to adapt themselves to local normative circumstances and do as the Norwegians do. I want to go to this concept of I want to talk more about moral economy because while it proves extremely useful, I think within the context of your piece, it is a fraught concept, and it's one of those things like culture where it's deployed a lot and people mean different things by it. There's like a culture speak, as Ulf Hannert says. There's also kind of a moral economy speak. So tell me a little bit how you think about moral economy, how you parse these different definitions, and ultimately, what is moral economy to you and what isn't it to you?
Yeah, so I use moral economy in a very old-fashioned way. So I just went right back to E.P. Thompson, and James C. Scott. And I use moral economy really the way E.P. Thompson uses it, to denote people's expectations of the way the economy should function, even if it's not functioning in that way. And then looking at the way those expectations shape, what people demand and also what kind of individual and collective action they take against elites or against the state, etc. So E.P. Thompson was writing about, English bread riots. But really, he was using the concept in a way that I kind of really adhere to, where he was looking at people's expectations around the prices of bread, right? And then how that led to collective action. And I'm taking very much a similar perspective where I'm interested in people's expectations around how the economy and the labor market and wealth should really function in the world. So that's really what I was trying to get at with this piece of research, is people's views of the way that work, income, and things like deservingness are interlinked in their minds, and how that shapes what they expect from life, really, from the future, but also from institutions like the state.
There is this tendency to treat every economic transaction or exchange as a kind of a new moment for strategic thinking. And as you point out, as Thompson pointed out, these exchanges are very much conventionalized and governed by custom. So I'm totally on board with that. I agree that we need to return to the Thompsonian approach to moral economy. This means, however, that you don't probably agree so much with Didier Fouksman and the way that he thinks about moral economy. Is that right?
I'm not sure I would say I disagree. I just feel like I found the Thompsonian use of the term really useful in this particular setting. So I used it that way. It's maybe less of a critique and more of a kind of utilitarian approach of what can this concept give me to help me kind of parse what people are saying and this kind of bigger puzzle that I'm really intrigued by. I will say that I do think that I shift a little bit away from Thompson's or Scott's use of the term, in that they seem to be really interested in the way that moral economy or these expectations in the economy led to forms of resistance or struggle. But I kind of, in a way, I'm asking the opposite question, where I'm interested in why there isn't resistance or struggle, why people are accepting the status quo, or if not the status quo, then some vision of how the economy should function that's much more backwards looking. And in so doing, kind of decide not to demand certain things. So it's, in some ways, it's very much the way Thompson and Scott are using the term, but in a way, it's also kind of flipping the question. So it's less about demands and more about acceptance, you could say.
Sure. That. Yeah, I think that maybe the way that to think about it, or maybe the way that I was thinking about it, was that it's almost as if you could go back and interview folks on the eve of the bread riots and in the kind of before many of these reforms and changes were made in the United Kingdom, and ask them about their preferences. And we're trying to make sense of the fact that they seemingly preferred outcomes or an institutional architecture that wasn't necessarily favorable to them. You would think, in your case, that it would be most favorable to people to actually just get money for not having to do anything other than being a member of the society. And yet, as you're pointing out, they have certain moral expectations when it comes to how money is distributed in their society, and that there's this really important connection to labor. So, like I said, I think the moral economy framework that you use is really interesting and very much illuminates the interviews that you're doing. And there are these wonderful ethnographic portraits in the piece that clarify that people do, in fact, have strong preferences for something like a job guarantee, or as I think you even point out, direct employment by the government. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, it's tricky because South Africa has forms of government work programs, for example. And even in the exact neighborhood where I was doing this research, there were some government work programs that were running. And the people that I spoke with would say things like, oh, the government should just employ us directly. And then I would say, well, there are these programs. I mean, what do you think of them? Do you use them? Do you participate in them? And people were really dismissive of those programs. And this was largely because they pay very, very little. They're unstable, so they're very part-time, so 2 days a week. The community work program runs 2 days a week. They're seen as very feminized, so a lot of it is actually care work, which is seen as the domain of women. And they weren't considered proper jobs at the end of the day. And so people would say, no, what we mean is a proper job, so full-time with proper pay, doing proper work. So it was in a way almost like a utopian view of what the government could do. And I think actually it would be much more difficult for the South African state to employ everyone who's unemployed full time with really good pay than to to do it like a universal cash transfer or an unemployment grant. So it's interesting because it really wasn't about realism. It was about these kind of utopian views of what should happen. They're just kind of inflected in particular ways.
I love this phenomenon where people love the idea of the government or the state, but hate the actual agencies that are associated with the things that they want. I think that this is something that we not only see in South Africa, but elsewhere. And I think this is one of the really valuable contributions of this piece, is that what you're showing us is that the demand, the preference, it is about jobs, but it's really about the jobs and their connections to kind of adequate compensation. So can you tell us a little bit more about how the moral discourse links work with money, and specifically the difference between money from labor and money that isn't from labor?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think there's different dimensions. And I think one dimension of this is the question of value and being valued and feeling valued and how value is expressed, right? So when you get a paycheck, you know exactly what your value is, right? You get it in the form of a paycheck. And I feel like there's a kind of longing for that clarity in a way. You know exactly how much you're worth to someone. And that's why there's such disdain, I think, for these work programs that pay very, very little, because they don't fulfill that kind of dimension of money from work. And then I think there's a general mistrust of this idea of money for nothing. And it seems so deeply rooted that sometimes people couldn't even tell me why they thought you shouldn't get money for nothing. Sometimes people would kind of just laugh when I asked why you couldn't get money for nothing, as if it's almost self-evident. And in some of my other work, I've talked about this as a kind of moral grammar. And I like the word grammar because it kind of implies this deeply embedded kind of unsaid thing that people can't explain. Most people, if you ask them to explain grammar, they actually can't. They can't explain why, they're conjugating a verb in a certain way. It's just the right thing. And sometimes I felt in my interaction with people around this idea of you can't get money for nothing, that people were almost taking it as that kind of inherent thing that was almost beyond explanation. But then once we got into some of these explanations, then they would say things like, well, it would make you lazy if you got money for nothing, or you would sit on the bed all day, or I don't want to just sit on the bed all day. I spend all of my time sitting. And also worries about misspending. I heard that a lot. You'd spend that money on the wrong kind of things.
Where do migrants fit into this story? You talk about xenophobia in the ways in which immigration kind of complicates the discourse that you're hearing from people.
Yeah, that's a great question. That wasn't a question that I set out to study at all. That wasn't kind of part of my original thinking or interest. But Jeppestown has actually been a key site for these waves of xenophobic violence that have sort of come up multiple times in South Africa. It's been a key place where that has happened, where there has been a lot of violence against migrants from other parts of the African continent. And in my interviews, this started coming up spontaneously. Again, I didn't ask any questions about this, but people started talking about xenophobia and migrants and the way migrants do work without me prompting them. And I think the reason why is because I was, trying to unpick people's expectations and views around work and money. And besides having this deep-seated sense that money should come from work, I think people really also had the deep-seated sense that work should lead to money. Eventually, if you worked hard enough for long enough, you should become wealthy. And this isn't in the paper. This came up in actually later interviews after I wrote the paper. I've been more recently asking people about their views of the wealthy, also in this neighborhood. And they really affirm this. A lot of people would say, well, wealthy people probably worked really hard for their money. Either they did crime or they worked really, really hard for their money. So it seems like people are really kind of attached to this narrative. But then when it comes to migrants, they would say, well, the problem is that they work for too little, or they're willing to take jobs that pay too little, and they break apart this relationship between hard work and income and eventual wealth, or at least the good life. And yeah.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and it almost seemed linked to a kind of South African identity as well. People would say things like, we didn't struggle for these kind of jobs, or this democracy wasn't meant to bring these kind of jobs. We South Africans can't take these kind of jobs. There's almost a kind of, I don't know, a mix of kind of nationalist pride kind of woven into this.
Sure.
And so,
yeah, go ahead.
And so people would say, we're not xenophobic. They really wanted to tell me this. We're not xenophobic. We just think that these migrants shouldn't take these jobs for so little pay, because they're lowering the pay for the rest of us.
It's one of these areas where I feel like academics sometimes they don't entirely follow, they kind of miss the plot with respect to distributive justice. We have this tendency to think about money as the thing that people have fairness concerns about. And what many people appear to be fixated on in a context like South Africa is actually the fair distribution of things like wage labor or good jobs. So it's really interesting. I wanted to conclude talking about this article by getting to what I think is probably its most provocative claim, where you more or less say that James Ferguson, who's written this widely read book, Give a Man a Fish, is maybe not getting it wrong, but there's some nuance that needs to be introduced to discussion about declarations of dependence. You write that your interlocutors seem to be, quote, seem to be invoking specifically the access to cash through labor as a declaration of independence, which flips Ferguson's argument on its head. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, independence or maybe interdependence, depending on your perspective. Well, I do want to just say initially that it's complicated and it's nuanced, because I do think, and some of my interlocutors even said that, of course, if we were just given more cash from the government, we'd take it. It's not like we would throw it back, at the government. We would take it, but we would prefer to get good jobs for all of these listed reasons. And one of the reasons that came up was this sense of, cash from the state is good for children and it's good for old people. But part of being an adult and part of being independent is having a job and being dependent not on, the state for these cash payments, which people seem to really feel should go to those who were somehow physically unable or prevented from working. So there did seem to be this kind of workerist perspective. So yeah, I think it's very complicated and it's really nuanced. You have independence from these transfers from the state, which people really seem to think should go to people who can't physically work. But then, as James Ferguson points out, there is this kind of dependence on your employer, but maybe it's seen less of a dependence as a kind of interdependence. There was a lot of talk also about being an employer oneself. A lot of people seem to aspire to that, and how that was especially good because you yourself would then create jobs, if you say opened a car wash or a bakery or whatever. So there did seem to be this view of jobs as a source of autonomy, maybe that's a good word. And also the creation of this kind of interdependence between the employer and the employed.
It sounds like we can also take more seriously the ways in which people try to manage their dependencies and reconfigure them. And what might appear to us to be a form of dependency is actually the basis of independent relationships vis-a-vis other actors in their lives. I'll never forget when I first went to do fieldwork in Norway. This was actually the first interview that I conducted in Norwegian. It was with this pensioner in his 90s. And I'm this kind of naive American. I've come over, this guy's living in a cottage provided by the municipality. He's living on his pension provided by the government. He spends all his time at a government-run senior center. And the question I asked, which I thought it's almost embarrassing to share, was how does it feel to be so dependent on the government? And he said, I'm paraphrasing, but he said something like, I really don't see it that way. Yes, I'm materially dependent on the municipality or on the state, but my family has always known me as an independent person. And now I'm in my 90s. And that dependency is what allows me to preserve that sense of independence vis-a-vis my family. They don't have to take care of me. They don't have to give me a place to live. They don't have to give me money to buy groceries. I have all of that stuff. And so I get to be the same person to all the people that I've always been, I get to be the person that I want to be to those people, which I thought was really, for me, at 22, I found this like a revelation. Okay, that what I see as a form of dependence is actually the basis of this broader freedom that he really values. And so it sounds like there might be something going on here. So that I get what you're saying, that you're not necessarily writing that Ferguson is wrong, and that doesn't come across in the piece. But there is a more complex way to think about dependence and independence with respect to wage labor. If it's all right with you, I want to move to defending the wage. And your work in Namibia, because you're versatile as an ethnographer. You're not just working in South Africa, but in Namibia. And in Namibia, you have some data that allows you to say something about the actual attachments that people experience with respect to wage labor. And you described three forms of attachment: the moral, the psychological, physiological, and the social. And I thought maybe we take these one at a time. So can you tell me a little bit about the moral attachments that people have to wage labor?
Yeah, well, I think it's coming out of this kind of moral economy framework or moral grammar framework that I was just talking about. And it's this, exactly what I was saying before, this deep-rooted sense of you can't get money for nothing. You have to work for money. And also you demonstrate your deservingness and also your virtue. I mean, it's really the classic capitalist productivist work ethic, right? Work ethic as a form of virtue, as a form of moral deservingness. And I very much heard the same kind of rhetoric around that in Namibia as I did in South Africa. And what I think was especially interesting about my Namibia fieldwork is I did a fieldwork in Ojivero, which is a village where there was a universal basic income pilot in 2008, 2009. So I was curious to go there. I mean, that's what initially kind of beckoned me to Namibia. I was curious to go there and see if people thought differently in a place where they had gotten the universal basic income. And I will say that there was much more kind of broad support for the policy. People were saying it was a great 2 years, it was a great policy, should really bring it back. But what we really need is jobs. I mean, I even had one person, kind of an older woman that I was speaking to, saying, again, she said, yeah, good policy, bring it back. But really, if the government was to do one thing, they should build a factory next to the village so we could go work in the factory, which I was so kind of fascinated by and why that would be.
Prefer to, to just getting, something deposited in your bank account. While reading the piece, I really was struck by the similarities to the kinds of things that I hear in Norway. The way that I've tried to conceptualize this is that in Norway, you have, among many people, less of a work ethic and more of what I call an employment ethic. Because it's really interesting. Both Norwegians themselves and many folks that I interviewed that have moved to Norway, immigrants, have said that their perceptions in the workplace is that Norwegians actually don't like working so much. Like when they're at work, they're not like, really grinding out the hours, and there's no like value that they're necessarily ascribing to working really hard. But there's this overriding concern with having a job. So how do you make sense of this ethical attachment or this moral attachment to employment, but not actually to the labor process or to the work process? And it sounds like maybe there's something a little similar here, because it's not like people are really dying to engage in like backbreaking labor. They want those relationships. They want, as you point out, the compensation, the adequate compensation that comes with having a job, and maybe a way to structure their time. All the kind of, not only the manifest benefits of employment, as Maria Yehoda put it, but the latent ones as well. Time structure, feedback, something to do collectively with people, a place to go, and so on. A factory is very much a place to go. So those are the moral attachments. Tell me a little bit about the psychological and physiological attachments that you found among people.
Yeah, well, in a way, it's exactly what you were just saying, a place to go, right? This idea that, again, also this came up in my South African fieldwork, this fear of just sitting, this kind of longing for busyness. And I will say to what you were just saying, there is a little asterisk I want to add, and this again came out in particular in my South Africa fieldwork as well, is that once I actually got into people's work histories, people, they would tell me about all the times that they actually quit jobs as well. So they would voice this longing for employment, but then they would tell me about all the times that they quit all of these terrible jobs that they had in the past. So I do want to add that because I think it's important, because I also think it's worth emphasizing that, again, to what you were just saying, this longing for employment is a kind of utopian longing for a sort of idealized vision of work or of having a job. And then faced with reality, people often end up in these really terrible situations that they then are willing to leave.
What are people, when it comes to the social attachment dimension of wage labor, what are people getting at?
Well, I think that it's really about connection to other people and community. And again, it links to these fears around just sitting. The woman I mentioned earlier who was talking about wanting a factory built next to Ojivero, she talked a lot about kind of boredom and isolation and being at home. And she actually had 9 dependents to take care of. So she was surrounded by at least children and young people. And I would say that she had a lot of work to do as well. But she was really insistent about, wanting to be engaged and busy and out of the house in this kind of very particular form, in this very particular way, which I thought was so interesting. And then another key interlocutor of mine who's in Jeppeston in South Africa actually showed me a poem she had written, which was a kind of ode to, she used to work as a taxi dispatcher with a lot of other women. And she was a poet, she had written this kind of like very sort of melancholic and nostalgic ode to her former colleagues, to the women she used to work with, talking about her sisters and how they would work together and the kind of community and sociality that they would have that she was really missing. So there's that kind of dimension to it.
It's fascinating that longing would be so acute that she would want to express it in poetry. But it really is something that people think about. Towards the end of, I want to get at, so while you are finding this kind of widespread, it sounds like a common preference for jobs or a job guarantee over basic income, even though people aren't necessarily opposed to basic income, you discover that reframing basic income as a dividend or rightful share kind of changes their minds a little bit. Say a little bit more about that.
Well, I was actually thinking about this when you were talking about your first interview with the elderly man and about dependency and this question of dependency. So I think the other kind of nuance to this question of, what's dependency, what's autonomy, what's interdependency is really how people perceive where the money is coming from, right? So I think something like, I don't talk to a lot of pensioners, so I'm kind of guessing here, but I'm guessing that something like a pension from the state is viewed really differently, because the idea is, you worked for a really long time, you paid your taxes, and now you're getting this thing that's due to you. And I think that people don't really view it as a kind of similar dependence to something like welfare. And I think that's the thing about having a job versus getting a cash transfer in a place like South Africa. And I think that was what was coming out in my interviews as well, is people viewed having a job as at least a very different kind of interdependence, because you are doing something for your boss, right? And then you're getting something back. So yes, there's an interdependency there, but it's also an exchange. Whereas social grants from the state were seen as very much this kind of one-way thing, something like charity or beneficence. And that's why I started thinking, well, what if we stop talking about social grants or unemployment grants or basic income grants? I'd been using the same language of grants that is widely used in South Africa. But then I started wondering, what would happen if we changed the language? Would people actually think about this differently? And there is a kind of broader, I think, impulse in the kind of advocacy community around basic income to play with this or to try this a little bit. Maybe even dating all the way back to someone like Thomas Paine, who advocated a kind of semi-proto basic income based on the inequality of land distribution and a land tax. So I thought maybe the easiest way to do this in my interviews is to say, well, what if South Africa's natural resources were, the profit for mining them was divvied up amongst people as a monthly cash payment, all that gold and platinum, etc. What if you got those profits every month, as a check from the government? Yeah, and people would change their minds. People would say, "Oh yeah, no, that's a great idea. We should definitely do that." And then I would say, "Okay, well, you were just telling me that you're really worried about people spending, grants from the government on alcohol and becoming lazy and just sitting on the bed. So what about all those things? Wouldn't you still worry about all of those things?" And then people would say things like, "Well, but that's our money. And if it's your money, you could do whatever you want with it. I mean, that's the point of having your own money is you can spend it freely."
Yeah, I love it. It's
Uh,
like it's not money for nothing anymore. Now it's money very much for something. And I love the reference to Thomas Paine. It also reminds me very much of Marcel Mauss's The Gift, um, where he frames kind of early French social legislation as some kind of indicator of return to this group morality that he's been describing in these different societies characterized by reciprocity. Essentially saying that, and I'm paraphrasing that, in the wage labor relationship, yes, you're compensated for what you do, but over the life cycle, they're not necessarily compensating for all you've done as a worker. And if we kind of scale that up, the working class, the people at large, are not being properly compensated or totally compensated for everything that they've done. Employers and society as a whole still owe something to these people. So, these early welfare schemes, they aren't a handout. They're giving people what they deserve for what they've given to society. So I think this kind of playing with language and making people okay with seemingly getting money for nothing, as you're pointing out, there's a long-standing tradition there. We're still trying to tweak the language, but you can tweak the language and get a different response. And so I think that you're onto something that's very important there. Okay, so I wanted to kind of conclude, Liz, after your discussion of this preference for jobs in this way, the different ways in which you could reframe the basic income conversation. You talk about some utopian possibilities. In a more recent piece, you talk about, you and a co-author, Elise Klein, discuss what sounds like to many people might be itself a utopian possibility, which is the widespread adoption of what you call a reparations way of thinking with respect to distributive justice. Could you tell me a little bit about what that is, and what kinds of possibilities you think that might open up in the global discussion we're having about things like basic income?
Yeah, well, as we were just discussing, I've become really fascinated by this question of framing and how framing policies in different ways leads to people making different kinds of demands or expecting different things or wanting different things. And I think actually to circle back again to James Ferguson's work, actually, I think his writing about the rightful share is also really useful here. This idea of viewing cash from the state, for example, as something that's rightfully yours, which again came up, in my interviews. I just think that right now, at least in South Africa, a lot of the people I spoke with definitely didn't view cash grants or social grants as their rightful share. But I think there's a possibility there. And what's necessary is a kind of new imaginary around work, around income, around one's rightful share and what one can demand from the state. And I've kind of been playing with these, how can we think about something like universal basic income or cash transfers or any kind of redistributory policy really in these more kind of demand-oriented ways or in these kind of new imaginaries. And I think, this idea of a natural resource dividend that I was using in my interviews is one. And then this idea of reparations is another, right? So again, I think a place like South Africa and Namibia is really interesting as a kind of lens through which to look at these questions because of their particular history too, right? This history of colonialism, apartheid, and racially based exploitation and expropriation. So myself and Elise, we started wondering what happens when you look at demands or framings of universal basic income through this kind of reparatory lens. What happens if you kind of take this approach of thinking about basic income as a form of reparations? And in a way, I think the seeds were already there because for a lot of basic income advocates, basic income kind of is a form of reparations for the inequities of capitalism. Again, going back to Thomas Paine, it was a kind of reparations for the fact that land was distributed really unevenly. And then, for other thinkers, you could view it as reparations for the kind of class exploitation, expropriation that's been happening. But then we started asking, what happens when you add these very particular historical claims and demands, like reparations for colonialism or reparations for slavery? Because there's a tension there, right? Universal basic income is supposed to be universal, and yet certain groups of people have much kind of larger reparatory or more explicit reparatory claims to make than others. So we were trying to explore, can you square the universalism with these kind of historically specific claims? This is also spurred by the fact that the movement for Black lives in the US had universal basic income explicitly as part of their reparatory agenda, actually, which we were both really struck by as well. So that's sort of the kind of the thesis or the core argument of the papers is how you bring the universalism and the historic specificity together.
And how ultimately do you see those two things coming into alignment with one another, especially because, as you mentioned, you have different groups making different claims based on, overlapping time periods, but also different phases of dispossession and extraction and marginalization and oppression. So how do you adjudicate these different claims to come up with a kind of universal understanding of what distributive justice might look like that takes into account reparations? Or is that not possible?
Well, I think it's a matter of scale and geography. So for instance, if, say, Namibia demanded reparations for colonialism from Germany, and Germany paid those out, and those went to people as a universal basic income, say on a regular basis. That's both a kind of a reparatory scheme and also within Namibia, a universal distributory scheme at the same time, right? But then it becomes trickier in places like, for instance, the US, if you make it part of the Movement for Black Lives agenda, can you still keep that universal instead of universal basic income? And the Movement for Black Lives kind of dealt with this by saying we should have universal basic income plus or universal plus basic income, where certain groups actually get a bit more than others because of this particular history, but that you still kind of keep the advantages of some of the universal elements.
Sure. And I was saying, it also probably, it becomes tricky too when you start to engage in the quantification of dispossession and of trauma. And once again, I think of Marcel Mauss. In folks like Viviana Zelizer, that the actual quantification of a debt, its concretization with a numerical value, is a way to ultimately cancel a relationship. You stop passing that debt back and forth to one another, which is the basis of a relationship or a sustained relationship, and you create the possibility of going your separate ways. Now, obviously, countries can't do something like that, but it is. I struggle to imagine that even significant reparations in the form of cash or aid or whatever would fully cover the debt that is owed. Obviously, there's this dimension. It is itself a form of recognition, and there are other forms of recognition that go along with reparations. But it's always struck me as a little bit too tidy. The aspirations to overcome, the sum total of all, like I said, all that trauma by fixing a value to it. I don't know if you've ever read Zelizer's, Pricing the Priceless Child, but it seems like an attempt to do that. What do I owe you? Just let me know what I owe you, so we can deal with this. It's really difficult and yet necessary because something is clearly owed, right?
Yeah. And that's, I think, where this idea of a reparations way of thinking comes in too, because I think it is really important to note that reparations is not just about this transactional payment, but also about the recognition, right? And the apology. And I think that's also what we were trying to bring to the universal basic income conversation, which I think really did the kind of redistribution piece, but not the recognition piece. So we're trying to think, well, can you have the recognition and the, to kind of go with Nancy Fraser's framework, can you have the recognition and the redistribution somehow married and somehow together? Because I think that's when you think about a lot of distributory, redistributory policies, that's really been missing. And again, kind of to go full circle, I think that's why they're usually framed as a form of charity or beneficence or generosity, rather than something that, is ours and is to be claimed, rather than, just thankfully received, right? And we were wondering if putting in that kind of recognition piece or that reparatory way of thinking can bring in that element. It's easy for people who read my work or who kind of hear me speak about it to kind of assume that I'm myself a sort of proponent of the sorts of things that my interlocutors long for. So I think it's worth saying that I myself am a big proponent of these kind of more radical, more universal redistributory policies like universal basic income or negative income tax or wealth taxes, whatever. I actually am not kind of very, very partial to one particular form or another. I just think that we live in the world of affluence, and we can certainly guarantee everyone in it, a basic standard of living, whatever form that may take. And I think that's very much within our reach. But I think to get there, we need to take people's intuitions and moral logics and longings really seriously, even when those longings are, I would say, kind of deeply nostalgic views of maybe a kind of imagined, Fordist world that perhaps never existed, certainly never existed for a lot of people in South Africa, for example. This idea of full employment, doing things in factories and getting kind of recognition and citizenship rights from it never existed in that form for a lot of the world's population. But I do think taking it seriously isn't the same as necessarily implementing, say, a giant jobs guarantee in a place like South Africa. I'm not necessarily an advocate for that. I think that we can think in kind of much more interesting and creative ways. But I think we also can't just assume that because a policy will benefit a certain group, that they'll kind of be on board and be ready to campaign for it. And I think you kind of see that within the universal basic income advocacy movement, that I do think they're missing a kind of grassroots dimension. A lot of UBI advocates are, either academics or, I don't know, tech elites or whatever. And it's kind of interesting to think about why there isn't more of a grassroots movement and demand for something like a UBI. And I think that's why I think we haven't seriously engaged in these grassroots imaginaries around work and money. And that's kind of the next step that is needed.
Well, it's wonderful that you are engaging with those things, and we will look forward to continuing to follow your work. So, Liz, thank you so much for being on Mergers and Acquisitions.
Thank you for having me.